Hi, this is Paul. I want to take another little bite out of this meaty conversation.
So let maybe we'll. I definitely want to ask this question. So it's become increasingly difficult for the Catholic Church, perhaps in particular in the West, to attract young people. I don't think that's a statement that anyone would disagree with. But people are watching my biblical lectures, and lots of them are young, and they came to the lectures. So why is that exactly? What's going on there? I mean, I don't know how to understand it precisely, and I can't work it out in my own mind. You're looking at it in some sense from the outside. What's the story there?
Now, there's a lot going on here, of course. And he's asking the Roman Catholic Church via the video that I posted today. I think it would probably be worthwhile for Jordan to ask himself why he doesn't go to the Catholic Church. His wife has certainly been interested in the Roman Catholic Church. I don't know to what degree she's attending Mass faithfully or regularly. As someone noted in the comment section, 1 hour a week, that's not really participation, and fair enough, you're right. Yet, I've told a story before of a conversation between a colleague of mine in a suburb here who has an excellent relationship with the local Orthodox priest. And one day in conversation, evangelism came up, and the Orthodox priest basically said, well, we're not really yet set up to do evangelism because we don't have our cathedrals and our monasteries. And I remember hearing that a number of years ago, and I didn't quite understand the response at all. Now, having been in this for a few years, I understand the response a lot better. Bishop Barron, who, of course, leads Words on Fire, basically talked about beauty first. A lot of the neo-sacramentalist churches are working on that. Now, I think it's important to not overlook the question of Catholicism in this. I've been watching the Jesus Music movie. I think it's a little uneven. I like the first part quite a bit because it was a nice treatment of some history. I think the movie sort of gets lost in a few different places. Not that what it's talking about is not well done, but it sort of loses its focus after a while. But I should hardly be a person who points fingers at that. And I think part of it has to do with the question of beauty and evangelism and music. Sam made a comment on the Thief in the Night live stream that I had a few days ago that I am using my Vanderclips channel now to post little bits of things that I want to find and maybe play. I've also been playing quite a bit lately with posting little bits of video on Twitter, and I can contextualize them within words and tweets, and then sometimes I'll reap those and put them onto my Substack. So I've been playing around with some different forms of medium, but part of what's going on, well, back to the Jesus movie. Over the last 50 years, there have been various significant movements of people into the church or between the churches in North America. And maybe I can find that thing. This is a chart showing America's changing religious landscape. And there's been a considerable amount of conversation with respect to the labels and the rise of the nuns. And you can see no religion over here in this area right here. And John Vervaeke has talked about that. Catholicism has in many ways been buoyed by immigration. Evangelicalism has had its ups and downs. To a great degree, evangelicalism has probably sustained itself by people migrating away from the main line, which has had a significant drop, and into the evangelical world. One of the things that came up in the Thief in the Night live stream, why do I call it Thief in the Night live stream, is because I plunk into the Discord server. Well, patterns are developing, of course, but I plunk into the Discord server unannounced and basically try to pick up conversations with some of the randos there who assemble randomly and see if, in fact, we can glean any wisdom from each other. And I've been very happy with how this has gone. Sam made some comments about music the other day. Now, the sound is low at the beginning, but I figured out how to turn it up on the Discord server. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that I don't know that people, and perhaps this is true of Jordan's decision to not attend church. I don't think people attend church because it's good for them. I think maybe after you're a Christian, you do so. But as I've said many times, deciding to become a Christian is not like selecting a reasonable used car. It's much more like falling in love. And for that reason, the art and the beauty is forefronted in someone's decision whether or not to go to church.
The Protestant section of the Discord has been talking about Protestant contributions to art recently. That's been a subject for like the past week or two. And what comes up over and over again is that Protestants' main art form is music, right?
Yes.
Especially because we, are kind of down on the icons and even perhaps down on like church architecture and stuff like that. A lot of Protestant artistic energy gets funneled into music.
So in other words, for Protestants, and I think this has been true for a very long time, because if you look at, let's say, various English revivals, hymnody was central for evangelism and church education. I mean, there are these moments in the history of the church in England where hymns are absolutely central to the revival of Christianity in those times. And I think that has certainly been true in Protestant churches in America since the counterculture. As Byrne Power has noted many times, people were attracted to Woodstock, and then, of course, Woodstock was followed by Altamont, and people went to San Francisco, they got into drugs, they were completely liberated, and they found it to be a disaster. And what happened in Southern California with Calvary Chapel and the Jesus movement is that you had this movement of people who basically said, I need Jesus to fix up my life. In other words, going to church wasn't another thing to do in your spare time set alongside Netflix. Going to church was something alongside of going to the emergency room because you obviously aren't responsible enough to manage a human being, much less a family. People discover themselves having kids, etc., etc. And of course, many of those people were interested in music of various kinds, and so they began to naturally, as one would do, start playing that music in church. Now, Chuck Girard is someone who's in this movie fairly early on. I remember listening when I was fairly young to a Chuck Girard album that somehow my parents had gotten a hold of. I think I listened to that record more than my parents. And a little bit of Christian YouTube trivia. Chuck Girard is Alicia Childers' father. Just think about some of those connections. And so what takes off in America is massive amounts of young people start going to the church. And now you'll have your I think we do the church and Christianity a disservice too often in this space when we look at charts like this to underestimate the continual power of the church in the culture. It's a little remarkable that on one hand, we all talk about the church as if it's sort of dying or dead, and on the other hand, even though this is part of sort of the shadow boxing that Megan Dahm and David Fuller talked about in their recent conversation, you always see the left just complaining to high heaven about evangelical churches and their political power. I mean, Jesus and John Wayne is basically a version of that. Oh, look at this is horrible. But all of those, many of those people, came to this because Jesus cleaned up their life and they're looking for order, and their order has to have a structure. And so if we go back to the earlier question that Jordan asked here, basically saying, well, why isn't the Catholic Church filling the gap in the culture that has been left behind by the recession of the culture? Well, first of all, the Catholic Church was never here in America. Protestant churches were there. And Protestant churches themselves were different from the Catholic Church in that, in many ways, the church that filled the hole at the center of American culture was sort of the Protestant invisible church, that if you know something about Protestant theology, has sort of become the alternative to a embodied physical hierarchy and structure like you have in the Church of Rome. So I would have to say that, while I'm sure some of you who are Roman Catholics and know your history in America far better than I do, some of the mass movements into the church in North America have in fact fueled the church in the world, and other places in the world have fueled them back into North America. And anyone listening to enough of the randos conversations that we have around here certainly know that there have been many deficiencies in the evangelical church in America. But let's not miss the fact of its power. I mean, how many of the randos conversations that we've had, just listen to Paul Anleitner's first conversation with me and his recent conversation with Karen Wong on the meaning code. How many of you in the Jordan Peterson world started going to church because your parents found themselves adrift and basically clung on to the church? And I'll tell you something, in Protestant churches, the psychedelic experience and the transformations often happen through music. Yeah, there's some through preaching and through, that's some of us who are much more left brain types, maybe in that way. But I'll tell you, the percentage of people that work through their faith on a daily basis through music is far greater than those who are, being able to remember their pastor's sermon. So in that respect, the Catholic Church, even though in some ways it's stronger than, is the Catholic Church stronger in America than it is in Europe? Or does it just keep changing forms? So as I said, I have my clip channel here. Another clip that I grabbed today. Tom Holland was giving a lecture about persecution, and he sort of wove through it his own story of where he's at with respect to faith. And then he answered a question by Gavin Ashenden.
Start with Gavin at the front here. Questions, not statements. We haven't got much time. Thank you.
He looks at Gavin and says, Gavin, questions, Gavin. You're a preacher. You're prone to rambling on, bloviating, as one commenter made on my on one of my videos recently.
I want to throw back to Tom a question he once asked me, but I'd like him to answer it. Tom, once we had a small discussion, and you said the very distinctive thing about the church was that, as you quite just said, it really does believe in good and evil. It's nothing if it doesn't have a metaphysical vision. Most of the people here, I think, would sign up to that metaphysics. One difficulty we have is persuading a highly secularized society that our metaphysical vision isn't something at the level of Victorian fairy tales. As someone who straddles both worlds, do you have any advice for us in the way in which we can reacquaint our society with the seriousness of what is almost a dualistic metaphysical narrative in order to catch their imagination sufficiently for us to be able to tell the Christian story with effect?
Now we have a very little interesting tie now between Tom Holland and Jordan Peterson. One day they'll talk, perhaps. Who knows?
Well, I think the key is for people in the West to be culturally humble and to recognise that their values are not universal, as I said. So another one would obviously be human rights. Because the West has been so hegemonic for so long, it's been in a position to assume that its concept of human rights is somehow universal. They don't need to think about it. Of course human rights exist. But what the rise of China and of other civilizational powers is doing is to remind us that the concept of human rights is one that has emerged in a very specific cultural matrix, which is a Christian one. And that therefore, if you want to believe in human rights, you have to believe. It takes a leap of faith to believe that there are things called human rights, just as much as it takes a leap of faith to believe that the Lord Jesus Christ raised from the dead. They're both beliefs. And the fact that most people in the West sign up to the fact that human rights exist and that they're important and that they should determine, say, national policy, public policy, actually it's as rooted in theology and myth and metaphysics as all the teachings of Christianity. And I think that once people are reminded of that, I think it becomes impossible not to feel a kind of greater sense of where, what Christianity is about. Because, if you believe in human rights, why not believe that Jesus rose from the dead? You might as well hang for a sheep as a lamb. I think
Charles Taylor, in his book, The Secular Age, talks about speeds and religion. And he talked about part of reform, big R, of which the reform, of which the Protestant Reformation is just one part, was going from 2 speeds to 1 speed. And an example of that would be, let's say, you would have the church. People would go to church. They had various levels of moral capacity that they had learned. But the first, let's say the highest speeds were the priests and the monks. And the idea was that the church was supposed to support them. The monks and the priests would pray on behalf of the people, send their support up, and the monies would go down. And that was sort of the way the world worked. And Taylor talked about part of what happened in Reform was that you tended to have 1 speed. And you could look at that with, let's say, Geneva, Calvin's Geneva, where you have the priesthood of all believers, clergy that can marry, and Calvin trying to create a holy city. Same with Zurich. Same with the the Puritans that come to New England and found New England and New Haven, Connecticut. And so Taylor talked about one-speed religion. Now, got a fair amount of pushback on that from Mary Cohen back when we talked about that, and I've continued to think about it, and I've continued to think about how, in fact, there are many speeds. In fact, it's probably something a little bit more like a hierarchy, in that often we think of the spiritual athletes, who are the monks, let's say, and then we might think of, we think of secularity down below here, and we think of closer to heaven up above here. So you have the athletes who are the spiritual monks. You can hear this in a lot of, kind of beneath a lot of what Jonathan Peugeot talks about. And then let's say maybe we've got the priests who are sort of, touching the people and with the people, but they're sort of in the middle. And then let's say you have church attenders who are people going to church. And then you have people generally in the culture. And down here you have secularity. Now, these things have functioned differently in different cultures at different times. And so in Christendom, you basically had a hierarchy like this. I've talked before about the fact that this was in some ways, even though in Protestantism, you didn't really have monks and athletes. You had priests, maybe priests, but probably pastors. And then of pastors, of course, you had higher levels like, Billy Graham, let's say. You had celebrity pastors, levels like that, but you still had levels. And up until especially 9/11, there was a degree of moral alignment between the culture and the church. And part of what happens after 9/11 with the rise of new atheists is that there's this attack, basically supposedly sort of inverting the moral hierarchy, but not really, since new atheists were fundamentally using Christian morality and critiques to challenge the church, which is, as Bishop Barron said, not always an unhelpful thing that happens. So in some ways, so you've got Jordan Peterson down here, complaining about the church. And so in that sense, continuing in the tradition of the new atheists. I guess I can make this a little smaller so you can see the whole thing as it develops. And asking, why is the flow not better up here? And that's been a question for quite a few people. I remember even in the 80s when I was attending seminary, every now and then we would have the conversation that, well, why aren't the brightest and the best going to seminary? Which, of course, sort of put us in our place. We were we're not the brightest and the best. The brightest and the best are going to Ivy League schools, and they're becoming doctors and lawyers and journalists, and they're playing on a bigger stage, and they're becoming well known, whereas in fact, I had a history professor that when I told him I had decided to go to seminary, tried very hard to talk me out of it. And of course, this was at a Christian college. Because he said, well, you're wasting your gifts and your talents if you go into the ministry. And of course, I was, 20 years old or something. So I didn't know how to respond to a response like that. But he didn't have enough influence in my life to really change my path. I very much felt a call by God to do this. And, deep within Christian formation and a Christian tradition, if it was a college history professor and God, the history professor lost. So I, in fact, of course, did go into the ministry, went overseas into missions, and then wound up here in Sacramento and now on YouTube and the strange life that I've led. But you basically have this hierarchy. And one of the things that I thought a lot about, especially in the Protestant realm, was the fact that in this hierarchy, within these speeds, let's make the triangle a little bit bigger. There are, of course, all sorts of layers and levels going here, but part of what Tom Holland notes is that down here below, the formation from above continues to hold sway. And Tom Holland noting that human rights is an heir of Christianity. And part of what Tom Holland has also noted is, and others, including, say, Douglas Murray and Jordan Peterson, is the anxiety that if you lose that which has the attention up here, if you lose the ideals, well, you'll tend to lose this too. It's almost, in a sense, the idea that rather than sort of a foundational thing here, actually the culture is being suspended from above. And that if you lose the belief at these levels, it will no longer sort of hold up the culture. And the culture will collapse into other layers, of hell, as it were. And so Peterson, now given his own learning track that he's been on, has sort of been complaining to the Catholics about, hey, we're those of us sort of being suspended down below here. We're a little worried that, the bottom's going to fall out of this culture if you don't fix it. Okay, so let's talk about the hole in the middle of the culture where the church used to be. And obviously in Europe, in the areas that did not experience the Protestant Reformation, well, in France in particular, there was an awful lot of fighting about this hole around the time of the French Revolution. And one of the things that the revolutionaries discovered with the back and forth that happened through that period was that even if they could knock down the institution of the church, it was not so easily dispelled. Julian the Apostate discovered exactly the same thing, that in fact it had a power that, in fact, I think gave rise to the organization or the institution, but the power wasn't the institution itself. And again, in the French Revolution, where there were all these shenanigans about the government was going to install priests and you're taking over church buildings, and I mean, there's just back and forth and back and forth. The old structures continue to sort of either change or reconstitute themselves. Now in America, you have this history of the invisible church with Protestantism, which basically said that with the Establishment Clause, well, at least early on, different states had their own established churches, but that went away fairly easily or fairly early. The invisible church sort of functioned in that hole to a degree via the people, even without an institution. Now, I've read George Marsden's The Twilight of the American Enlightenment, in which he notes that back in the 1950s, it was simply assumed that clergy would have a place around the table in terms of public policy. Some of what I've read in James Wellman's book on the megachurch, in his excellent chapter on Chicago, noted that in Chicago, at the beginning of the 20th century, the mayor would have certain critical pastors on speed dial. Now, that might be true still in some places in the American South, in the Bible Belt, where there's a lot going on. But obviously what has happened, especially since the 1960s in the counterculture, and then since 9/11, churches have sort of been shown the door. And as Jordan Peterson continues to be anxious about, new things tend to come in to try to fill this space. Wokeism, let's say that religion. And again, I'm not so much a woke alarmist, not to say that I don't think that these things can do a lot of damage. But they're simply not terrifically well formed, that they tend to fall apart, and they don't tend to be able to constitute much beyond a sort of moral signaling. So this is, of course, the anxiety that Peterson has, and he in some ways wants to imagine that the Roman Catholic Church can perhaps come in here. But I wonder, first of all, I don't think it would ever be able to do so as it did in Europe, and I don't know that how it could reconstitute itself even in Europe, even in countries such as Spain and France and Italy. I mean, you have to remember that as late as the 19th century, you had papal states in Italy that were actually owned by the Roman Catholic Church. And, it was Napoleon that came through and, I don't know the history of it here well, but basically ate up the papal states. And it wasn't until Italy finally was able to form itself as a nation state that, and the Vatican was left to, just a tiny little space in the middle of Italy that is its own thing with its own guards, et cetera, et cetera. So what has happened instead in the West is that in many respects, as I said previously in my ad hoc conversation, the church has sort of gone invisible. And so when you take this picture and you add to it the picture that I drew in the previous video, where, let's say, at the top of the hierarchy, you have established church leaders. Then you have people who participate in the church. And then you have people down below who don't go to church. But still, at this speed of the leadership, they're continuing to sort of suspend the culture and keep it up. All right. And so this question of why aren't people going to church is being asked by anxious Jordan Peterson and anxious Tom Holland, recognizing that in many ways the suspension of the culture is depending upon the health of the church. And unlike Europe, where Roman Catholics don't have really the cathedrals in America, they haven't had time to get into the culture, and they're not building cathedrals in America like they would. Quebec churches are empty, and, if I talk to Cale Zeldin, he reminds me, and Cale Zeldin and Brett, why can't I think of his name right now? Hey, and Bishop Barron, Catholicism in America wasn't a terribly beautiful thing. In fact, it sort of became Protestant-like when it came over to this country. And the Orthodox don't have their cathedrals or their monasteries. It's going to be music in many ways. And it's going to be preaching that sort of provide the pressure to hold the walls to suspend the culture. All right, so let's go back and hear what these two Roman Catholic theologians are saying. I think Peterson, so he's an academic, and so it's very clear by his priority of conversation partners that he prefers academics. But when he asks a question like this, he should probably talk to someone who is actually working with people on the ground. And given the fact that so much of, I think, the richness that he brought out in the classroom was because he was also a practitioner of his craft, not just an academic who dealt with it in theory.
I think part of it's just a sociological, cultural question where in the minds of many young people, perhaps most people, religion is an undifferentiated mass. And what religion means is basically what the technical term would be fideism, that you believe something that you have no rational reason to believe. And
Now he just gave the new atheists an enormous amount of credit that I don't know that they definitely deserve. One of the better conversations that I think Peterson has had in the second wave was his conversation with Clay Rutledge, where really both of them were speaking as researchers. And whereas I think in theory there's a degree of plausibility to this answer, in practice I think the better answers are, why don't people in sort of their pragmatic evaluations of proximal betterment find value in the church? And I think music, beauty, the church's capacity to help people do better is really where this answer is better addressed. One of the major waves of church reform and revitalization, and some might say corruption and degradation, was of course the seeker wave. And what happened, and this gave birth to the megachurches. And again, whereas the vast majority of churches in North America, or in America, are less than 75 people, a significant number of people who do go to church go to megachurches. And I think a big piece of that is because the psychedelic, shamanistic power of music that megachurches can generate that little churches cannot. Okay? That's part of the reason megachurches are so powerful. Another reason for this, well, let me go back to my whiteboard because I always like my toys. Okay, megachurches. Why disproportionately do people favor megachurches over small churches? I think one answer has to be music and its shamanic power, or let's say its psychedelic power that people want and desire, and let's say it's healing. It doesn't seem incidental to me that the young people who basically turned away from psychedelics turned towards music and completely changed the main Protestant art form in America. Byrne might want to have a conversation with me about this stuff. So music is a big piece of it. Another big piece are services, and by that I don't mean the worship services. I mean counseling, benevolence. It's basically helping the poor. One of the really interesting points made in George Yancey's book about the difference between mainline and evangelicals, was it in Yancey's book or Wellman's book? I think it was in Wellman's book, was that basically in evangelical churches, there was more participation in benevolence. Mainliners tended to prefer to give money to some do-gooding organization that would sort of outsource the time and messy involvement with the poor and professionalized it. There's a lot of cultural things going on in there. Whereas, generally speaking, with evangelical churches, people would have the experience of directly helping someone. Now, when helping hurts, there's a lot of issues in that. But again, I think part of what we're seeing in this is that these mega churches have been really able to give transformative experiences and deploy them broadly into the culture. And that's a big part of the reason they have succeeded. Now, Catholic churches have done that as well, partly because they had a lot of historical structures through which many of these things could happen. But you sort of have the difficulty with an older tradition that it's not unlike, let's say, having an old house. You can have a really cool old house, but if you're going to run Cat 5 in it, if you're going to upgrade the electrical, if you're going to have plumbing that works, if you want the in-floor heating so that you don't, I grew up in a house that had steam heat, and so, banging registers and radiators when the heat came up, and anyway, I won't tell too many stories. So in a brand new house, well, you sort of build to suit. And so Protestants in America have a lot less legacy stuff that they have to deal with, whereas Roman Catholics can, in some ways, have a very beautiful and meaningful and credible edifice, but it might not be terribly practical and nimble. Although, reading the book Reformations, I was quite impressed at how within the Catholic Church, within their orders, within the conventicles, within the societies, they've actually been able to have a fair amount of nimbleness within. So, don't want to take anything away from them.
And you've just embraced it as a matter of kind of a personal mantra, but otherwise it's completely irrational. I think in most young people's minds, that's the case. So the general trend we see within Catholicism is more, the specific trend we see within Catholicism is more just a general trend of people leaving religion. And I think why your work...
And again, that's religion-S. That's how secularity defines religion. But as I said before, I think if we understand the role of speeds, we'll see that in many respects, they're opting for secularity and probably finding ways to sort of outsource their religiosity and keep it submerged beneath secularism.
Has been so important for those of us who are Catholics is that you are showing that that's not what religion is. Now, we can have very important and timely questions about why the Catholic Church hasn't been doing its duty, as it were. We're part of the Word on Fire Institute, and that's precisely what we're seeking to do. That's precisely the mission of the Word on Fire.
And so Word on Fire is a great example. So Bishop Barron is a Roman Catholic bishop who is actually in charge of evangelization, and they're using these tools. And Roman Catholics in the 20th century were quite adept at embracing radio and television fairly quickly. So, props to you all.
Fire Institute. But your work has reestablished that connection for millions of people who have a false idea, one, of religion generally, but two, of Christianity and Catholicism in particular.
Yeah, I think that's right. So part of your lectures, I think, are showing a dialogue between faith and reason, because obviously you have the scientific background. You're a professor of psychology, and you know about the empirical science and all kinds of things. But you're also taking these questions of faith seriously. So,
and as you know, when I make these kinds of videos where I'm being a bit critical of Peterson, a number of you rise to his defense, which, you know, way to be a good loyal mook. And I'm not looking down on you for that. But again, and you know, the point that he makes, well, if I was inside the church, I wouldn't have the audience I have. I think that's right. But yeah, you know, there's lots of layers to this. And he is, in a sense, defending religion from the outside.
for us, that is really bread and butter, part of the Catholic tradition. So there definitely are some forms of religion, even some forms of Christianity, that would want to pit faith against reason, as if faith and reason are in an MMA fight, and they're, going at it, and they're going to, choke each other out. And well, on our view, that's not true. On our view, God is the ultimate source.
And if you want to listen to a conversation about what do we mean by this word reason, listen to John Vervaeke's conversation with Sevilla King on equality. I always get this wrong. Equality Existence channel.
Source of both faith and reason. So John Paul II put it in a very beautiful way. He said that faith and reason are two wings that the human person uses to fly up towards the truth.
I think an error that these two are making right here, that Jordan Peterson can't make because he's not within a tradition, is that now, after years of consumeristic carpet bombing, people are astoundingly sensitive to tribal propaganda. And so when you have a conversation like this, if you just keep promoting, oh, by the way, we have the answer to this. This is our thing. We have the answer to this. You're really going to lose some people. I have a little easier time of it, partly because most of you don't live anywhere near a Christian Reformed church. And I've had enough of you go out and visit a Christian Reformed church and come back and write me and say, that church isn't anything like your channel. And I've had enough people visit my church and say, your church doesn't seem to be like your channel either, and you're the pastor. So, one of the things that I don't try to do is try to always say, well, the answer to that is become a member of the Christian Reformed Church. I think you have to participate in the conversation, but really trust people to, if they want something more from you, they'll do that on their own.
And so the idea is that there's a kind of harmony. They're different, right? Your left wing's not the same as your right wing. These are two different things, but they are not set at odds with each other. They're in harmony. So you see this sort of harmony in figures like Augustine, who wants to combine a kind of Platonic philosophy with a Christian wisdom. And then you find a different kind of synthesis in someone like Thomas Aquinas, who wants to combine an Aristotelian philosophy with a Christian wisdom. And then you find a similar sort of combining in many other figures in the Christian tradition, John Henry Newman, John Paul II, etc. And so I think, in a way, one way to interpret your work is as another way of bringing together faith and reason in this conversation, in this dialogue. And it's certainly part of the work I try to do as a professor of philosophy. I mean, some people say, oh, you're a professor of philosophy. You're supposed to be, how could you be Catholic? And I think that question is nonsensical if you understand the Catholic view of faith and reason. Yeah. That faith and reason are not, on our view, opposed. They're working together. They're in harmony. And part of the intellectual adventure, I think, is talking about these questions and bringing these two sources into fruitful conversation.
In a very basic sense, faith cannot oppose reason. Because if God is and God is one, then any truth, whatever formulation that truth is taking, it cannot be opposed to itself. This is a fundamental principle in the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. And so,
but I don't know if that articulation is going to convince a lot of people who, well, they probably wouldn't be listening to this video anyway.
Any statement that would be irrational, we as Catholics would reject. But faith is supra-rational. And we talked about this earlier in the conversation, right? There's a sense in which there's an invisible but real foundation to reason itself, both logic and empirical observation. And then there's a destination for where it's headed. So in that sense, faith is never against reason, but it's the condition for the possibility and the purpose of reason.
So part of it, you think, is this demonstration of the coexistence and maybe the necessary coexistence or the optimal coexistence of faith and reason. But there's another aspect too, a couple other aspects. And like maybe this might be a consequence of the empirical revolution in human thought, is that maybe the modern church has concentrated too much on emphasizing the propositional at the expense of the enacted. And I could see that happening a little bit in our conversation, so I'm trying to find places to stand that are really solid, and like the idea.
Well, and I think he sort of is getting here at the beauty first thing, because when I listen to those of you who are going into orthodoxy, some of you have some theological reasons for it. Of course, Luke will throw out some words at you and tell you everything that was wrong about John Piper. But I think, when it comes to most people, I mean, beauty is so broad, and Bishop Barron said this very well in the Four Horsemen video. I mean, beauty is so broad, it casts the net quite a bit. Now, those of us who, for whatever reason, in order to have a certain degree of internal harmony, have to kind of put things together, well, we're going to have to work out these questions. And I think it's at that level that a lot of these conversations are happening, and where the theology and the philosophy are super helpful to sort of solidify us and give us a sense of peace in this place. And I think it's at that level that Jordan is struggling, because he's obviously, a very intellectual man, a very intelligent man. So those are many of the issues that he's dealing with, not unlike C.S. Lewis.
That we have an instinct to admire, and that we can extract out the pattern of what's admirable, and that we can then deify that and assume a relationship between that and the ultimate ideal. That seems very solid to me.
I really like this new theme that has come up in the second wave. I mean, he talked about this with Peugeot. He talked about this in the Four Horsemen video. He talked about this with Lawrence Krauss. He's obviously working on it, and I think he's really barking up a fruitful tree.
I don't feel any internal disunity about those propositions. That's different, or about those suppositions, let's say. That's different than the claim that, there was a God who exists outside of time and space and who created the universe. That's more like a set of statements that you need to believe, whereas the first set is a set of answers to questions that everybody has. And maybe that's,
and not so much answers as articulations, but that there are embodied ways of addressing the needs. And again, that's why people go to church, because the church is helping them with betterment that scales.
I was trained as a behavioral psychologist. I was trained as a cognitive behavioral psychologist, but I concentrated more on the behavioral element, how to help people change the way they act and to make that central. And I try to do that in my lectures. It's like, well, everybody needs to know how to act. No one disputes that. The audience doesn't dispute that. And then figuring out how to act is a great mystery. And
I think he's answering his question a lot better than the other two did. No offense if you other guys are watching, but I think Peterson's answer here is very good.
We all seem to be guided by our conscience, and we can't escape that conscience, even though we might like to. And we all seem to have some sense that some things are good and other things are evil. And so what's good? And is that what we should pursue? And how is that represented? And those are all solid questions, and there are solid religious answers to them.
I'm going to have to make a clip of this because I thought this was a terrific portion of John's conversation with Sevilla here that I think gets at exactly why people decide to, again, back to meaning. You will sacrifice yourself for meaning. We know that. People do it all the time when you have a child, when you join the army, when you work at a job that makes less money but is more meaningful. You're actually pursuing, as Bishop Barron said, the transcendentals.
If you take away value.
Well, but see the problem, and I know you've talked about this. The problem, and we have to be careful when we say that to people who are listening, because value doesn't mean what it means within the Enlightenment framework. Value means my stated preference about something. Mm-hmm. That's not what value means. Value means that there's a this is what I understand in per se, or how I see you using it. Value means a fundamental connectedness, right, that orients things in a profound way. It's so that my love of truth is not something that I prefer. It is what makes it possible for me to think. Mm-hmm. So value isn't, if we're going to use this word, it's not at the level of our preferences. Yeah. It's at the primordial level of our grounding. It's right. If I don't have, right, if I'm not oriented towards the truth, mm-hmm. if I'm not oriented towards the good, if I'm not oriented towards the beautiful, I am not a cognitive agent. So for me, we're just talking about sort of the transcendental aspects of relevance realization. If we don't have those, you're not a cognitive agent.
Yeah.
Every time you select your attention, you're loving the true, you're loving the good, you're loving the beautiful. That's without right. fully unpacking it.
Yeah. Well, I think he would say, I would say that kind of value of preference, that could be parasitic processing. If you are valuing, if you aren't oriented, because he has if you're coming at it not through this openness to quality, and this is very this is where it gets very difficult to explain what he's talking about. It's kind of like the Zen not knowing, it's kind of like the not knowing of some of the value. And I would say that is the
but you can't do science if that's your value. Right? If you try to do science that way, you get corrupted by funding, right? So when scientists are at their best, but I'm going to reinforce your point. When scientists are at their best, they're doing it because they love the goodness and beauty mm-hmm. of truth, right? And then when you say, well, tell me how the world is.
Again, it's why do you go to church? Why do you pursue Christ? Why do you seek out God? You're pursuing all the transcendentals at once.
Is such that makes sense to you, right? What is it about truth that's inherently good and beautiful that draws you into the practice of science? And tell me how that sits within your worldview. That's a way of putting it, right? Because if the scientist is drawn by anything other than that, the scientist will not engage in what is fundamental to science, which is the continual attempt to overcome self-deception. Mm-hmm. Science is a family of methods for overcoming self-deception in our attempt to understand the world. Science isn't its propositions.
So you're talking,
and I thought that was a really good point. And I think this is parallel to Peterson's point that religion isn't the propositions. Now, religion is, it's far more foundational. And his point here about him being about the behaviors, that's, religion is obviously acted out. Now, again, I'm a confessional Christian, and so I'm not saying that the propositions aren't important. Propositions are part of the network that we have to use. But again, as I've said many times, if you read the New Testament, we're always judged according to what we do. Narrative is a powerful compression engine. Action is even more powerful. Action is, in many respects, the most powerful way we can compress reality in our world.
But then there are these more abstract propositions that seem to make but people bounce off them, and young people bounce off them because they're more like they're like an insistence about what you must believe propositionally, rather than answers to questions about how to walk through life, given the questions about life's mysteries that you all have in your head.
Now, part of what we're dealing with here is, I think, our perennial struggle against constraint. In our culture, especially with individualism, we have a strong liberationist aspect. And liberation is obviously one of the values that the Bible discusses. The truth will set you free. The Israelites are freed from slavery in Egypt. But of course, you've got the two kinds of freedom, freedom for and freedom to. And so, it's not uncommon for any of us to have to deal with this question of will. Why am I constrained? Well, some of that constraint is for your good. Some of it might be tyrannical. So the propositions always constrain us. Gravity constrains us. Various factors of reality constrain us. And Peterson obviously doesn't have any difficulty pointing out constraints that one must live with and to some degree overcome, or at least contend with, if you're actually going to be able to achieve something. And as the point I made earlier in the video, part of the constraint of Protestantism against certain imagistic manifestations of art has led them to develop music in a very explosive way.
And it's the latter that I'm trying to explore and address in the lectures, and I think that's partly why people find them acceptable. They don't just bounce off them and say, well, that's religious claptrap, I'm done with that, and reject them the same way they do, at least to some degree.
And I think part of it is also that as religions bounce into different cultures, they have to contend with the furniture in that culture. And there's no religion, I think, in the history of the world that has been more effective at dealing with this dynamic than Christianity. When Jonathan Peugeot was talking to Styx, he brings in basically the I don't remember now offhand, the logoi spermatozoa mentioned in Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr got that from Greek philosophy. And so part of what we're doing now in our culture is dealing with this question of continuing the ongoing theological work of having the cultural terms meet Christianity. Back to this letter from C.S. Lewis to Arthur Greaves. At the end of this letter, C.S. Lewis makes a point here that isn't dissimilar to Peterson's. The doctrines we get out of the true myth are, of course, less true. They are translations into our concepts and ideas of what God has already expressed in a language more adequate, namely the actual incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection. In other words, the doctrines of the church are derived from the actuality at all of the different levels, and for that reason, we wind up with difficulties as we go through time. The creedal articulations of the doctrine of the Trinity, for example, are within the philosophical categories and language of their age. Now, that is not to cast skepticism on them, but it is important to recognize that if you want to deal with what we mean by person and all of these issues, we have to look at that. And Brett Sockold's book about real presence in the Lord's Supper basically asserts that Luther was misunderstanding Aquinas, and because of his misunderstanding, he was basically attempting to reinvent what Aquinas actually said, all the time complaining and denying Aquinas. And that has led to a lot of back and forth in the church over the sacrament, which is central to the faith. In other words, the actions and the physical layer, in many respects, are foundational. And I think it's for that reason that we can see, number one, why in some ways fundamentalism has outperformed theoretical modernism in preserving the faith. And we can see why, let's say, the strategy of the Anabaptists have, in another way, in their, let's say, their action-oriented biblicism that arises out of the Protestant Reformation, also in some ways have had a leg up. Although, of course, all of those traditions struggle. But that gets back to what Lewis noted here, that all of the doctrines, we use the stuff that we find in the culture, we use the philosophy, we use all of this, and we then try to express, because we have to, in language and in terms and in propositions, what happened in history. And we've been struggling with that all along. The doctrine of the Trinity has to deal with Judaism, its conceptualization of God, and Jesus Christ, and then the coming of the Holy Spirit. So you can't have three gods, you must have one God, but that one God is manifest in three persons and is three persons. I got to be a little careful about a modalism there. So these are what we're struggling with, and in many respects, a lot of this is what Peterson is talking about right here, in that the work of theology has to go on. And now this is where, on one hand, the work that these theologians and trained theologians is indispensable, because they have a knowledge of the past, because you don't want to lose the thread. But at the same time, it needs to be updated, re-articulated, and for that reason, Peterson's sort of coming in from the outside with a fresh reading of it and struggling with it from the outside does, in fact, give us a fresh voice.
Church attendance and trap, I'm done with that, and reject them the same way they do, at least to some degree. Church attendance, and I'm always exploring a mystery with the audience in my lectures, and I'm not telling them what I believe. I'm not even telling them what I believe.
No, you're telling us a fair amount of what you believe, but you're doing it in a very winsome way. And he's right, he is doing it in an exploratory way. And people find that engaging. Those of you who write to me about why you soldier on through these overly long videos and all my bloviating also say that somehow this exploration with me, which is why I'm not just sitting down and giving you a lecture about what I think, but I'm responding to these videos, why you find this helpful.
I believe to be true, because I'm always questioning what I believe. And the reason I keep insisting on this in this conversation is because it really is something I'm trying to solve. It's like,
and something he's trying to solve for himself, which makes him particularly interesting in a Truman Show sort of way.
I do believe that we are in danger of making all sorts of things religious that shouldn't be, and that's going to do our culture great damage. And that unless we put God back in God's place and Caesar back in Caesar's place, things are going to be grim. And the church, the classical church, the Catholic Church, has to play a role in that. But I don't see it. I don't see a tremendous amount of evidence that that's happening among young people. So I'm not saying that with any sense of glee. Obviously, it's a mystery that needs to be solved. And so,
yeah, I think you're right that your lectures focus more on the existential and the practical and how to live this out. And I think that's really important. And in the Catholic Church, at least, part of what we do is actually offer young people a chance to do that.
And again, if you keep going back to your tribe, there's a cost to that.
So, for instance, at every Catholic university, at every Catholic parish, there's all kinds of outreach programs. There's all kinds of ways in which we're trying to live out this Christian message. Because at the end of the day, I think you're right. The living it out is so essential and so important. On the other hand, I think when you're...
The living it out is the thing. It's the thing. It's not the thinking about it that's the thing. It's the living it out that's the thing. That's what Jesus says all the time.
Living out something, there is at least implicitly some sort of theoretical view that you're living out. That is to say, if I live out a life of greed, right?
But it's an abstraction.
At least implicitly, I am saying, as it were, at least in my actions, that I think that money is the most important thing. And so, in a way, the theory, I think you're absolutely right. Just the theory is what I would have called earlier dead faith. Well, of course, that doesn't help at all. We need living faith. But I do think that a living faith is not going to live very long unless there is at least some intellectual content to it. And the reason for that is that human beings have minds and they ask questions. And so if people are...
And we navigate via the upper register. And the upper register is in some ways less transitional and subject to decay as the lower register is.
Asking questions, and my students in philosophy class ask questions all the time, and there's no answer at all, then I think that leaves the practice of faith being kind of unmoored and being kind of shallow. So I think you're 100% right. Like if I could say for my kids, would I rather have them have all kinds of theories and all kinds of abstract ideas and be an expert in theology and philosophy, but in their real life, they don't worship God, they don't serve people in need, they're a horrible friend, etc. Or the reverse, well, of course, I'd rather have them living a life of charity and the virtues and being a great person, even if their intellectual understanding was sort of thin. But I do...
Now let's talk about this a little bit. And I've discussed this in various older videos. Why do unsophisticated Christians so often outperform sophisticated Christians? Now, we talked about the hole in the culture, and we talked about this hierarchy, and to a certain degree, in our culture, the hierarchy is sort of an abstraction. The leaders major on words. And that's perfectly fine. Words, ideas. But as we also said, in times of rapid cultural transition, there's a lot of going back and forth with those. And it's the people down at the ground that are doing, as C.S. Lewis called, majoring in the more real things. Now, why is down on the ground? Is that more real because it's physical? No, because again, action is a compression engine that, let's say choice, because choice would be part of both worlds, mind and matter. Choice is the way in which this comes down. Now, what you have in a culture is you've got a whole lot of, let's see, which side should I put it in? I kind of want to put it on this side. In a culture, you basically have your stack. And your stack has been set. And this is where a healthy culture affords wisdom to people who haven't had enough time to develop it on their own through trial and error. And so your unsophisticated people, in many respects, if you have a healthy culture and they're working it, are just working the stack. And as long as there's not too much change, it works fairly well. But if there's a lot of change, then the old ways of approaching things are starting to decay. And then these workings are increasingly disconnected from the culture, and they're not producing the outcomes they used to produce. And it's in that way that it's called the hermeneutical circle, where all of this working it back and forth has to keep happening, where leaders are looking down at the ground and people at the looking ground are looking at the leaders, and you need relationships of trust between them, and you're probably going to need some sort of institution between them to facilitate all of that, so that, in fact, you will achieve something fairly workable. And it all takes time.
Do you think, given that people ask questions and people ask other people questions, I think if there's no intellectual content, what can happen really easily is it just sort of evaporates, right? That is to say that you give up worship, you give up service, you give up thinking that people that are different from you deserve fundamental respect. The practices end up going away, I think, unless there's at least some intellectual substance there. And then
right. The intellectual and the action are always connected, and they can be connected through traditions, through institutions. Basically, in some ways, that's what wisdom is.
Partly it depends on your person, like who you are. So I'm someone who really loves to read books. I love to talk about intellectual things. So for me, that's a big part of my life. Now, there are other people who are great people who, they don't read books and they don't like talking about issues, and fair enough. I mean, not everyone's alike. But I do think there are lots of young people that ask intellectual questions, right? They ask, well, how do you fit Genesis with evolution? And if you just sit there and go, well, I have no idea, just believe. Mm-hmm. Well, you could do that, but at least for us as Catholics, we're not fideists. We don't say, oh, just believe it. There's no explanation. We try to provide reasonable explanations of things. But I do agree with you. At the end of the day, living charity is the most important. And it's something that St. Paul talked about, right? If you give your body over to be burned, if you have faith to move mountains, but you don't have love, right? It's all worthless. And so love at the end of the day is the most important.
Yeah, I think an important distinction here is what's necessary and what's most important. They're not always the same thing. So what's necessary in order for Catholicism to become Catholicism? It must have dogma, right? Or else it's not anything whatsoever. So insofar as the Catholic Church has dogma, we have a set of propositions that we believe, many sets of propositions that we believe to be true in every way.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about maybe how we can conceptualize some of this. So as Lewis says, you have events, and these events are very real. They're physical. They're all of the layers that are in there. You observe them, and you look at processes, and so you abstract something like dogma. And the reason you do that is because you want to apply that further down the line with people who are separated from the events. So the dogma then gets reapplied down into the choices that people make. And gets connected. It was just someone who's calling me on the phone. Gets connected then into a stack, which can be a culture, and which can, help people. Then you've got your leaders, and you've got your masses, and then you're working all of those issues. And so that's why you always have the development of dogma. And if your events, if the kinds of things that you are looking for, let's say, are science, you're going to have dogmas from science. And now people say, well, but in science, they're always tested. Well, so is theology. And so when people say, well, the church people, they're always fighting. Yeah, you know what they're fighting and they're struggling is? It's the question of, to what degree do these things change? Well, I'm happy because they change too little. Well, I'm happy because they change too much. Well, I'm happy because they're forgotten too quickly. Well, I'm unhappy because they're gripped on too much. Well, you're all playing the process of what's most important, what should be kept and what should be set aside. And that's always happening. That's always happening in the church. And generally speaking, sort of with the Nassim Taleb Lindy effect, the things that are oldest, we've got time going this way, the things that are oldest tend to be most true because they've been most real and applicable in more different cultures, in more different times, in more different spaces. They're tested. This is sort of Darwinian assessment. They're tested throughout history.
That something can be true. Historically, metaphorically, literarily, morally, all these things we believe to be true. So that's necessary. But that's necessary for any group. It's necessary for any individual in order to have any kind of unified personality. So in that sense, it's absolutely necessary. Is it the most important? No. But that again, the most important is that these dogmas, as Chris has been put it, become alive. As St. Paul also puts it, without...
Right. So the dogmas, usually via traditions and institutions, go back down to the ground and work within the communities.
Without love, you are a gong that makes no sound whatsoever. And so if one of the critiques that has really hit home, that you've also made in previous videos, is that Catholicism is not calling its people to be heroes. That sticks with me. I think that's right. And we have within our faith what's called the doctrine of the saints, which in a very basic sense just means that we believe that there are people just like us who have lived in a way that exhibits what it truly means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. And if you look at the different kinds of saints, what you will find is vastly different kinds of personalities, vastly different kinds of interests, but two things will also be present. One, courage, and two, fidelity to the truth. Diversity across all other levels, but courage and fidelity to the truth. So I do think that this is a time for courage. And again, that's one of the reasons that I was so attracted to your work, because of the pushback that it's received. Pushback's perhaps the most diplomatic word I could say. But you remain consistent. And I see that's courage, and that's a model for us as well.
So a couple of comments on that. So, well, optimally, you want the optimal pattern of action to be part of your personality. And then you want the story of your life to be concordant with that pattern of action. And then you want the propositions abstracted from that story to be concordant with the story. So then you have the intellectual and, let's call it the literary, and the behavioral existing in harmony with one another. And I suppose a fully developed religious system would flesh out all three levels. And you see that in Catholicism. You have the patterns of action, you have the stories, and you have the propositions. So I agree with Dr. Kaiser that the dogma.
Okay, so let's map that out a little bit. Come on, you can do it. Well, you use Peterson's word. You have the action. You have the literary. I like how he puts this here. And then you have, let's say, the dogma. And these are always going back and forth between them, because in some ways the actions then get abstracted, he talked about that earlier, into the literary, and of course that goes through time. Actions are of course only remembered and stored at the literary level. And then in many respects, and you see this in the Bible, the dogmas are yet another layer above the literary level. So if you look at what church doctrine is and church dogma is, it is in fact usually abstracted from the text and the stories, which themselves come out of the actions.
Is crucial in Catholicism. You have the patterns of action, you have the stories, and you have the propositions. So I agree with Dr. Kaiser that the dogma is crucial, and it's partly too because the rational can undermine faith. And we always think, as modern people, we think, well, if faith can be undermined by rationality, then it should be. But as a practicing clinician, I see how devastating that is. So I had a client, for example, who was an extraordinarily creative person, brilliant person, and fundamentally a good person. But he had a very, very critical, rational mind. And it was always digging at his roots. And as long as he was an architect and an artist, and as long as he was engaged in creative activity, he could live. But as soon as he started...
Now, notice that Peterson, and he said, well, this happens to Catholicism. This happens all over the place. Because what Peterson is doing right here is exactly what we talked about. And this is why, again, his experience as a clinician is so vital for his power as a helper. So he's talking about this, what did he say? He was an architect? That architect's life right there. Now, Jordan is telling us the story. He's in that sense compressing the architect into a story that can be conveyed in a book, can be conveyed via YouTube, can be even conveyed. And we've got this vast storage of storytelling practices and culture and tradition and language, all of this in a sense to compress the architect into a story. And what he's going to do is take that and he's going to create for us a dogma about the relationship between reason and, in a sense, action or dogma. And so even in the telling of the story, he is illustrating the ongoing process that happens in religion.
To think, his thinking killed him. It was so brutal.
Because, of course, it's got to go back down to the lower level and be worked out in his life. His thinking killed him. And if you have bad dogma, you're also going to get messed up. You've always got these levels, and they're always going back and forth.
Everything was up for grabs. Everything was questionable. And you should say, well, you don't take anything on faith. It's like, well, you try to live like that and see what happens. That doesn't get at the problem that the untrammeled rational mind can be unbelievably destructive in its ability to go down to the depths and undermine and destroy. And so the protective structure that a functioning religious system offers is some protection against that element of untrammeled rationality. And that's also something I think the rationalist atheist types, maybe they haven't had enough experience with, say, seriously depressed people.
And again, see, they haven't had enough experience down at that lower level that hasn't been brought up into a literary level, into words, into story, that hasn't distilled up into dogma. And again, decide, well, religious dogma is never challenged. It's like, you're doing it right now. And it's being worked out at the lower level. And so people decide to throw off their religious shackles and leave the church, and they're going to make everything up rationally. So pretty soon they're reading astrology and doing all sorts of other irrational things because Christianity isn't rational. So, I saw a number in my dream last night. I'm going to go to Lotto and I'm going to win $1 billion. Well, maybe you will, but this is always the process by which we live.
Who've been driven to the depths of despair by a mind that just won't stop uprooting and destroying. And that's not only a personal thing in some sense, because it's easy for you, me, anyone to become possessed by these destructive ideas. And they're very powerful. And once they're part of us, we need an answer to them. and we need an answer to our nihilistic doubts. And what Catholicism offers, I wouldn't say uniquely, but definitely is the consequence of thousands of years of effort at keeping that terribly destructive destroyer of necessary faith at bay. And that's also a good way to communicate it, I think, to young people. It's like, look, you're going to be
It's pretty abstract.
plagued by these catastrophic existential doubts. What the hell's the point of it anyways? And that's particularly the case when things aren't going well and you're suffering unjustly. It's like, what are you going to do then? Well, here's how people have solved that problem, It's possible that we're akin to deity in some sense, that there's something transcendently important about consciousness, that you play a crucial role in the structure of existence. It's like no one can say that for certain, because what the hell do we know? But it's the best we've been able to manage in terms of, what was it, Milton? Didn't Milton write Paradise Lost to justify the ways of God to man? Mm-hmm. It's a hell of an ambition. In some sense, that's what this entire religious endeavor does, the literary endeavor as well. What's the point of all this? What's the meaning of this? And, when you think about that in too propositionally, and I also saw this in my therapy practice. It's like, well, what's the meaning of life? And I could easily get off on a nihilistic argument with some of my more intelligent clients. They had a rejoinder for every proposition about why life was valuable. But then if you said to them, don't be so sure that that part of you is your friend. Look what it's doing to you. It's so destructive. And it has.
It's just like Dr. Phil's multi-tool. How's that working for you? You're in my office, aren't you?
All of its self-justifying arguments, and they might even be coherent. But look at the consequences and then contrast that with your own experience. Like, when does that sense of nihilistic despair disappear? For some people, it's when they're with people they love. They're with friends or family. Some people find it in creative activity. Some people find it in charity. There are various sources of meaning, and that's not propositional. You see it in your own life, right? You can literally in therapy, you have people track that. It's like, well, you're nihilistically depressed. Let's watch your life for a week and.
Okay, and so what's he doing then in therapy? He's basically taking this schema and he is distilling it down, and he's saying, okay, what's going on in your life? And you're bringing that up into story. You're telling a story about your life, and then you're telling it into another level of dogma. And you're evaluating the dogma that you have in your life. Now, people sometimes say, well, you have to change your story. Well, you have these little dogmas in your story as well. And so therapy is basically working this process aloud with the person.
See how that ebbs and flows with what you're doing. And then see if we can get you participating more in what makes it ebb than what makes it flow. And
that's the A/B testing in terms of proximal betterment, dead reckoning.
That's empirical in a sense, right? I'm not asking you to believe something. I'm asking you to watch the structure of your own reality to
Yeah, but belief is sneaking in.
See where meaning manifests itself. And then you could say, in some sense, the sum total of where meaning manifests itself, that's where God resides. And that relationship with God that you...
And this again back to do what's meaningful, not what's expedient. For Jordan Peterson, within the iron box of secularism, meaning is sort of a gyroscope for navigation. And for Peterson, I think, in his system, towards God.
You described as the, what would you say, as that has to be maintained by our good behavior. I suppose that's that desire to live in that space of meaning. And then you can propositionalize that. You can say, well, that's associated with love, and it's associated with courage. It's associated with these classical virtues, and it's not these things that we've learned to deem as evil. And that's where you, is it reasonable to say that that's where you find God if you're searching? Is that an appropriate way of looking at it?
I think so. I met a guy one time who told me he went to a lecture, and the lecture was on God's existence, and the guy was lecturing. And then after the lecture, my friend came up to him and said, everything you say is a bunch of malarkey. There's no God. It's just, your lecture is just meaningless. And the guy said, okay, what I want you to do is for the next week, I want you to treat everyone that you meet as if they were Jesus in disguise. Mm-hmm. And the guy left the lecture and he went home, and, he gets home and, mom's there doing the dishes, and he thought to himself, well, if this were Jesus in disguise doing the dishes, I'd probably go up and help my mom do the dishes. And then Dad came home from work, and rather than ignore him, he said, hey, Dad, how was work? How's everything going? And, because if that were really Jesus in disguise, I would do that. And then they're eating dinner together with the family, and there's one hamburger left. And he turns to his brother and says, hey, why don't you have this? And the guy told me his life was completely transformed by literally 1 week of acting in this sort of way.
And that's something parallel to clean your room.
And that's not really surprising. Pope Benedict talked about this in one of his encyclicals, that one way...
the little tribalism commercials are not helping you. Leave the point there and trust God, trust the world to help people. Oh, that guy said a lot of things that really made sense. Who is he? Oh, he's Catholic. Oh, maybe there's a Catholic church down the road. People follow those breadcrumbs. And again, to go back to Jordan Peterson at Cambridge Union, in a sense, when you keep putting those little commercials in, you're stealing their joy. You're stealing their agency. You're stealing their power. Leave it to them, because it'll be far more effective.
Way to God is to act in this sort of way, to act as if God exists.
Right.
To act as if other people are Jesus in disguise. And, Mother Teresa talked about that too, that for her, the poor and the leper and the destitute were all...
At least he didn't say Catholic Mother Teresa.
All Jesus in disguise. And so she served them as if they were Jesus. And so that is one way, it seems to me, to move towards God. I don't think it's the only way, though. And the reason is that I know a philosopher, Alistair MacIntyre, who mentioned to us in class one day that he was an atheist until he carefully studied the arguments for God's existence. So there are at least some people, at least one person, Alistair MacIntyre, who really did come to God through that way. But I think the more common way is through lived practice, lived action.
Yep, I think that's right. And I'm out of time, so I'm going to cut it here. And I have no idea what I'm going to entitle this. And so far I've gotten good comments about the whiteboard. And so, I continue to evolve. And I hope this was helpful. Leave a comment. Let me know.